You were shaped by pain before you had any tools to defend yourself. That's the tragedy no one talks about, because to talk about it means to admit something was wrong long before you had language to name it. You were not born broken, but you were born into a world that broke you before you could understand what it meant to be whole. Damage didn't knock politely at your door. It seeped in through the cracks, through raised voices that weren't your fault, through silences that felt like abandonment, through chaos you mistook for normal. Children absorb everything, not because they choose to, but because they have no filters, no shields, no boundaries. The nervous system learns the world before the mind can interpret it. Long before you could ask asterisk, why is this happening? Asterisk, your body was already storing the answer. Asterisk, because you are not safe. Asterisk, that becomes your first truth. Not because it's true in a moral or cosmic sense, but because it was the only truth available to you at the time. There's a kind of violence in being made to feel unsafe in your most defenseless state. Not always physical violence. Often it's more insidious than that. It's the violence of neglect, of inconsistency, of being seen only when convenient and ignored when inconvenient. It's the violence of being gaslit before you knew what a lie was. You weren't given armor. You were told vulnerability is your natural state, but then they punished you for it. So you started covering yourself in ways that made sense back then. Silence, compliance, withdrawal, overachievement. Those weren't coping mechanisms, they were survival codes. The real tragedy is that they worked, and so you kept them. And now you sit in rooms and relationships where you're still operating from that original injury. You wonder why you sabotage peace, why you recoil from praise, why you assume people will leave. It's because some part of you is still living in the time before you had a name for what hurt you. You're responding not to the present, but to the past that taught you to flinch. The irony is that you weren't given the luxury of defense, yet now you're blamed for the very defenses you had to invent just to stay afloat. People ask you why you're guarded, why you don't trust, why you overthink every word. But they never ask what built those behaviors. They see the symptom and pathologize it. Rarely do they trace it back to its logical beginning, a child who needed safety and never got it. There's a profound injustice in being wounded before you could speak for yourself, before you could even understand what a wound was. But that's where the work begins, not in denying the damage, but in recognizing its timeline. You didn't fail, you were failed, and everything you built afterward, even the flawed parts, was an attempt to endure what should have never been endured. You were damaged before you could protect yourself, but now you can. That is where your power lives, not in what was done to you, but in what you choose to become despite it. You were handed shame like an inheritance, unwrapped before you could read, accepted before you could resist. And the worst part, you believed it was yours, not because anyone told you directly, but because it was embedded in the air you breathed, in the sighs when you cried too long, in the subtle recoil when you showed too much joy, in the way your needs were labeled as problems. So you learned to shrink, to apologize for simply existing, and to internalize guilt for feelings you never created. This is what no one explains. Guilt and shame can be taught without words. A look, a silence, a withdrawal of affection. It's enough, especially when you're young, especially when your entire sense of reality depends on the emotional stability of those around you. And so you accepted the narrative that you were too much, or not enough, or difficult. Not because it was true, but because you trusted the source of it. Because children always assume the fault lies within them. It's how they make sense of chaos. The tragedy is that you became fluent in a language of self. Blame before you even knew what selfhood was. You weren't just absorbing emotions, you were absorbing responsibility. You started taking ownership for other people's moods, their dysfunction, their coldness, their volatility. You became the peacekeeper, the emotional translator, the invisible glue. And in doing so, You developed an internal system that blames yourself for things far outside your control. There's a certain cruelty in being conditioned to believe that love must be earned through self-erasure. You perform, you contort, you hide parts of yourself, all to avoid the withdrawal of connection. And over time, the line between what I feel and what I'm allowed to feel becomes so blurred you no longer trust your own instincts. That's how inherited guilt works. It takes root quietly, convincing you that your pain is selfish, your joy is excessive, your voice is inconvenient. Even now, you may catch yourself apologizing for things that aren't your fault. You might feel a wave of anxiety before expressing a simple need. You might sabotage happiness because a part of you still believes you don't deserve it. That's not weakness. That's the residue of early programming. And it's deep, deeper than memory, deeper than logic. It lives in the body, in the nervous system, in the automatic reflex to smile when you want to scream. But here's what matters. Just because something was passed down to you doesn't mean it belongs to you. Not every emotion you carry originated from your own experience. Much of it was projected onto you by people too wounded to manage their own suffering, and it's not betrayal to let it go, it's survival. You were never the problem. You were simply in a system that needed someone to blame, and you were the easiest targets. Mole, voiceless, dependent, but you're not voiceless now, and your task isn't to redeem the guilt you inherited, it's to refuse it. Let it fall where it belongs. Return it silently, without apology. You don't owe your life to the ghosts who taught you to hate yourself. You owe it to the self that still waits to be reclaimed. You grew up inside a blueprint of fear long before you realized you were even living according to a plan. It wasn't handed to you as a diagram. It was built around you, piece by piece, until the walls felt like home. Not because they were safe, but because they were familiar. And what's familiar in childhood becomes sacred. No matter how brutal it is, fear didn't always look like monsters or violence. Sometimes it wore the face of routine. A slammed door, a sudden silence, the careful way you had to measure your words, like stepping through a minefield without a map. You learned to predict moods with a precision that no child should ever need. Hypervigilance became second nature, not because you were cautious, but because it was the only way to feel in control when the world around you was built on emotional quicks. And this is how fear becomes architecture. It constructs rules you didn't agree to but followed religiously. Rules like, don't speak unless spoken to, don't cry too loud, don't get too excited, don't need too much. Rules that weren't written down but enforced through tone, withdrawal, and inconsistent affection. They taught you that safety wasn't a right. It was a privilege, and it could be revoked without notice. The result, you began designing your inner world the same way. Your mind became a maze of second guessing, of bracing for impact, of rehearsing every possible outcome so you wouldn't be caught off guard. And even now, as an adult, you may find yourself living inside that same blueprint trace, bonding to situations as if punishment is always around the corner. You call it overthinking, but it's not. It's survival logic encoded so deeply into your foundation that it feels like personality. What people don't understand is that when fear is the first language you learn, safety feels suspicious. Peace makes you restless. Love feels dangerous, because the original architecture of your life trained you to expect pain in moments of calm. And that training doesn't vanish just because time passes. You carry it in your nervous system, in your breath, in your relationships. You build your present with the bricks of your past, often unconsciously replicating the very structures that hurt you. But this isn't your fault. You didn't ask for the blueprint, you just followed it because you didn't have a choice. No child does. What you have now, though, is awareness, and with awareness comes an unspoken responsibility to tear down what was never meant to shelter you. To examine the rules you are forced to live by and decide, one by one, whether they still deserve to govern your life. This isn't easy work. Dismantling a fear-built house means walking through it one last time, fully awake. It means challenging what once kept you alive, knowing that survival and healing often ask for opposite things. But hear this clearly. What was constructed in fear can be reimagined in freedom. The original structure may not have been your choice, but the renovation is. Choose to rebuild. Choose different foundations, because you deserve to live in a home that doesn't tremble when you speak. The most dangerous kind of harm is the kind that calls itself love. When cruelty arrives dressed in affection, it's not just confusing. It's disorienting on a fundamental level, because the mind can survive pain, but it struggles to survive contradiction. You were told you were loved while you were being silenced. You were told you were being protected while your spirit was being controlled. You were told it was for your own good, when it never felt good at all, and that's where the fracture begins, not just in the heart, but in your very perception of what love means. Children don't separate words from actions. They take both as one truth. So when love comes paired with fear, manipulation, or shame, the message becomes clear. Asterisk, this is what connection feels like, asterisk. And even if it hurts, even if it distorts you, it feels right, because it feels familiar. That's the trick. You weren't just learning relationships. You were being programmed with definitions that you would carry for years, mistaking patterns for destiny. So you entered the world thinking that love must always have a cost. That to be close to someone means enduring discomfort, abandoning parts of yourself, being made small in order to be accepted. And worse, you began to crave it, not because you wanted the pain, but because you had no other framework for intimacy. Love without control, love without conditions, it felt suspicious, inauthentic, because love to you had always arrived with a shadow. This confusion doesn't just disappear with age. It follows you into your adult relationships. You find yourself attracted to the emotionally unavailable, drawn to intensity instead of stability. You ignore red flags not because you're blind, but because your compass was broken early. And somewhere in the back of your mind, a whisper persists. Asterisk, if it doesn't hurt, it's not real, asterisk. That's not love speaking, that's conditioning. The problem isn't that you were loved badly. The problem is that you were taught to equate love with pain, silence, and sacrifice. And when that message is delivered early enough, you begin to doubt your own instinct. You gaslight yourself. You call your discomfort overreacting. You call your need for tenderness being too much. You shrink in relationships, hoping that being less will earn you more. But real love doesn't require distortion. It doesn't demand a performance. It doesn't come with strings disguised as support. It sees you entirely and doesn't flinch. That's not a fantasy. It's the kind of love you were supposed to learn from the beginning. And if you didn't, it's not your fault. But at asterisk is asterisk your responsibility now to unlearn the lies. You cannot redefine love without first confronting what you were taught in its name. That means grieving what should have been. It means acknowledging that your first teachers, no matter how well-intentioned, may have been wrong, and that acknowledgement is not betrayal, it's liberation. So if love ever made you feel small, afraid, or guilty, don't call it love anymore. Call it what it was, a misuse of power dressed in tenderness, and then begin again, because love in its truest form will never require you to disappear. There is a voice inside you that has been speaking for so long, you've mistaken it for your own. It doesn't scream, it whispers, it doesn't argue, it suggests, and the worst part is, it sounds reasonable, familiar, protective even, but it's not. It's an echo, a residue of the original wound. You call it intuition, instinct, a gut feeling. But often, it's trauma wearing a convincing mask. That voice was formed in survival, not wisdom. It was built in response to threat, unpredictability, and betrayal. So of course it's cautious. Of course it tells you to be silent, to withdraw, to keep people at a distance. It learned, long ago, that being visible meant being vulnerable, and being vulnerable meant pain. And even now, years later, in situations where safety exists, the voice still says "don't trust it." This is the cruel irony of early damage. It doesn't stay in the past. It time travels. It inserts itself into new experiences, new relationships, new opportunities, and filters everything through the lens of what once hurt you. You might think you're protecting yourself, but you're often just reenacting the same defense you had as a child. You're responding to shadows as if they're still solid. You meet someone kind, and your instinct says they'll leave . You succeed at something, and your instinct says you don't deserve it . You speak your truth, and your instinct says you'll be punished . These aren't insights, they're alarms, wired too tightly into your nervous system, tripped by anything that resembles the original harm, even vaguely. The problem is, the mind doesn't distinguish between familiar and true. What it has seen most often becomes what it trusts. So if chaos was your early normal, chaos feels comfortable. If silence was survival, then speaking feels dangerous. This is why so many people self-sabotage, not because they lack self-worth, but because worth feels alien. And anything unfamiliar, no matter how good, is interpreted as a threat to the system. So the question isn't why do I feel this way? The question is where did this feeling begin? Trace the voice. Ask it who taught it to speak, whose fear is it echoing, because if it isn't yours, and it rarely is, then you are not obligated to obey it. You are allowed to rewrite your instincts. You are allowed to pause before reacting, to interrogate the urgency that lives in your body. You are allowed to say, this feels real, but it might not be true. That's not weakness, that's wisdom earned the hard way. Too many people spend their lives haunted by scripts they never wrote, playing roles they never auditioned for, in stories that began before they had the chance to choose. But you don't have to keep repeating the same scenes. You don't have to let the echo narrate your future. Because healing is not just about letting go of pain, it's about learning to recognize which voice in your head belongs to you, and which one is just noise from a time when you had no choice. Healing isn't cinematic. It doesn't arrive with dramatic music or grand declarations. It doesn't knock on your door and say, "I'm here now." No, healing is smaller than that, quieter, less visible. It's not found in the sweeping gestures. It lives in the repetition, in the difficult, mundane choices you make when no one is watching. To speak instead of staying silent, to rest instead of proving, to stay when you want to run, or to leave when you've been taught to endure. Most people think healing feels good, but it doesn't, at least not at first, because to heal, you have to challenge the structures that have kept you functioning. You have to look at your defense mechanisms, not with judgment, but with precision. You have to ask, is this protecting me, or is this imprisoning me? And often, the answer is both. What once saved you now suffocates you, and that's the heartbreak of growth. You begin to notice how deeply your patterns are rooted, how even your most innocent reactions carry the weight of past survival. You catch yourself apologizing for your needs, flinching at kindness, waiting for abandonment even when there's no sign of it. You feel the instinct to shrink, to accommodate, to disappear. And in those moments, it's tempting to call yourself broken, but you're not. You're conditioned. There's a difference. The truth is, you were taught to abandon yourself long before you learned what selfhood was. So of course the process of reclaiming it feels disorienting. You're not just choosing a new behavior. You're confronting every internal signal that tells you it's dangerous to change. And that internal resistance is loud. It wears many disguises: perfectionism, procrastination, cynicism, even exhaustion. But it all traces back to the same fear. What happens if I become who I was before the world touched me? That's why healing is a rebellion. It's not soft, not passive. It's a radical act of defiance against the scripts you were given. It's not about fixing yourself, it's about refusing to remain bound by what you didn't choose. You are unlearning entire systems of belief. You are walking through the ruins of your early environment and saying, asterisk, I will not live here anymore. Asterisk, and that's not pretty. That's not comfortable, but it's sacred. There's no applause for this kind of work. No one hands you a certificate for breaking a generational cycle. You won't trend for choosing self, compassion over self, destruction, but that's what makes it real, because it's not performance, it's integrity. It's the quiet courage to live in alignment with the version of yourself that never got a chance to exist. So no, healing isn't heroic in the way we romanticize it. It's slow, repetitive, often invisible. But make no mistake, it is the most powerful act of all. Because every time you choose presence over avoidance, truth over silence, love over fear, you're not just healing. You're rewriting the entire narrative. And in that revision, you don't just survive, you begin.